Laureen Deschamps had been head sommelier at Chateau Miraval for 11 years. She believed she could measure a man's worth by his wine order. So when the black gentleman in the worn work jacket chose a modest Rhone, she let a thin smile spread. An interesting choice. Perhaps something more accessible would suit your palate, she said, loud enough for the investors to hear. He didn't react. He just thanked her. Then the managing partner walked in, pale, and told her the man had just purchased the entire vineyard. The man in the work jacket was Elijah Ibarra, a Nigerian-born entrepreneur who had just closed the largest vineyard acquisition in the Rhone Valley in 3 decades. But the real story isn't the sale. It's what his purchase exposed about the quiet architecture of French wine aristocracy, and what happened to Laureen Deschamps next. Chateau Miraval is not just a vineyard. It is a monument, a limestone fortress in the southern Rhone that has produced wine for 4 centuries. Its bottles sit in the cellars of French presidents, in private collections in Geneva, in the vaults of families who measure lineage not in decades but in centuries. To work there as head sommelier is to be a gatekeeper, not a server. Laureen Deschamps understood this better than anyone. She had climbed into that role after 15 years of training, memorizing every classified growth, every microclimate, every aristocratic name that mattered. She could identify a wine's terroir by scent alone. She could also, she believed, identify who belonged in her dining room and who did not. The investment group scheduled for that Thursday evening was precisely the kind she approved of. 3 men from Parisian finance, 1 Belgian holding company director, all in tailored navy and quiet watches. They had booked the private room for a celebratory dinner. The seller's side was being represented by the estate's own managing partner, Jean-Luc Fortin. The buyer, they said, would be arriving separately. Fortin had been tight-lipped about the transaction. The vineyard had been quietly listed for 18 months, a secret whispered only in certain circles. The asking price was rumored at 42 million euros. A handful of potential buyers had been vetted and dismissed. Then a late entrant appeared, a man with a portfolio of luxury agribusiness holdings across 3 continents. He had moved faster than anyone expected. The contract sat waiting in a notary's office in Avignon. When the door opened and Elijah Ibarra walked in alone, wearing a faded canvas jacket and boots that had clearly spent years walking actual soil, Laureen's smile did what it was trained to do. It stayed cordial while her eyes made their assessment. In 11 years, she had developed an internal taxonomy. Shirts without cufflinks, a distrust for. Watches she judged instantly. Accents she filed away within 2 sentences. She prided herself on being able to smell a tourist before they opened the menu. The man paused at the wine list, scanned past the flagship Chateau Neuf du Pape that Jean-Luc had recommended, and pointed to a modest Crozes Hermitage. A good wine, she admitted privately. But not the wine you order when spending 42 million euros. A man of means, she was certain, would have chosen the prestige bottle, so she allowed herself that thin smile. Her comment about accessible wines carried no hesitation. She delivered it the way she had delivered similar remarks to Americans, to Asian businessmen, to anyone whose appearance didn't match her internal catalog of wealth. The investors at the neighboring table glanced over. One of them smirked. The silent judgment was communal, a little ritual of exclusivity. And Elijah Ibarra simply nodded, thanked her, and asked to proceed. That should have been her first warning. A man who reacts to public condescension with complete stillness, that is not a man who is easily shaken. That is a man who has seen far bigger rooms than yours and has learned not to waste energy on small furniture. While she retreated to the cellar to compose a remark about his palate for the maitre d', Jean-Luc Fortin entered the room. He had spent the previous 3 hours on the phone with the notary, nailing down the final transfer clauses. When he saw Elijah Ibarra, he crossed the room with both hands extended. The room went quiet. The words he spoke next were simple and utterly devastating. Fortin had not known about the sommelier's comments, not yet, but the investors heard everything. And the maitre d' had already taken out his phone. Jean-Luc Fortin's voice carried across the room with the particular weight of a man who had just spent 4 months negotiating a deal he never believed would close. "Mr. Ibarra, The notary is ready. The acquisition paperwork for the entire Miraval vineyard is prepared for your signature. He said it with both hands extended, the way you greet a head of state, not a man in a faded work jacket. The investor's whispered conversation stopped mid-syllable. The maitre d' lowered his phone, eyes wide. And Laureen Deschamps, standing in the cellar doorway with a bottle of Croz's Hermitage in her hand, felt the world shift under her feet the way a vineyard floor shifts after heavy rain, slowly and then all at once. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which Laureen's mind raced backward through every interaction she had just had, replaying the tone of her voice, the volume of her words, the deliberate arch of her eyebrow. She had performed this exact ritual dozens of times before. It had never once carried a consequence. Now she stood frozen, watching a man whose palate she had just publicly dismissed accept the deed to the very cellar she was standing in. The bottle in her hand was one she had poured with reluctance. She now realized she had been pouring it for her new employer. One of the investors, the Belgian holding director, turned to his colleague and murmured a single word in French that translates roughly to catastrophe. It was not an exaggeration. Elijah Ibarra did not look at Laureen. He did not need to. He shook Jean-Luc's hand, exchanged a few quiet words about the notary's schedule, and then returned to his seat. He picked up his glass. He took a sip of the Croz's Hermitage. He set it down. And then he said, without turning his head, "I believe the sommelier had a recommendation for a table wine from the Languedoc. Perhaps she could retrieve it now." Every person in that dining room understood exactly what had just happened. It was not anger. It was not revenge. It was something far more precise. It was a demonstration of exactly who held the power, delivered with the same quiet composure that had unnerved her from the beginning. Now, to understand why this moment resonated far beyond a single dining room, you have to understand who Elijah Ibarra actually is. He was not a man who stumbled into wealth by accident. He was born in Enugu, Nigeria in 1971, the third of 6 children. His father sold textiles. His mother was a teacher. He earned a scholarship to study agronomy in Ghana, then a second to complete his master's at the University of Montpellier, right here in southern France, just 90 kilometers from the very vineyard he would one day purchase. He had spent decades building a quiet empire of agricultural holdings. Coffee in Ethiopia, tea in Kenya, a massive distribution network across West Africa. But wine was never just business for him. Wine was a language he had learned as a student, poring over soil composition maps while his classmates went out drinking. He had been in French vineyards before most French sommeliers had ever touched a vine. His acquisition of Chateau Miraval was not a random purchase. It was the culmination of a 2-year search. He had identified the estate as undervalued, mismanaged, burdened by a reputation that rested on tradition rather than innovation. The previous owners, an old wine family with debts they refused to disclose, had been quietly bleeding money for a decade. They had turned away modernization proposals from younger partners. They had refused to export to emerging markets. They had clung to a distribution model built for the 1980s. And when a Nigerian buyer appeared with a clean offer and no need for financing, they had little choice but to accept. The notary documents had been drafted in 6 days. The ink was scheduled to dry at 9 o'clock the following morning. But here is what Laureen Deschamps did not know. Here is what none of the diners in that room knew. Elijah Ibarra had arrived in France 3 days before the dinner. He had spent those 3 days visiting the estate, walking the rows of Grenache and Syrah, speaking with vineyard workers in fluent French, and quietly asking questions about the culture inside the chateau. What he learned disturbed him. Multiple staff members described a pattern of behavior from the head sommelier that extended far beyond a single misplaced remark. Complaints about elitism, comments about guests of certain nationalities, a reputation for making people feel small. He had heard about the time she refused to serve a Chinese collector because she assumed his credit card would decline. The time she redirected a group of Senegalese diplomats to a lesser table near the kitchen. The pattern was clear. And then he decided to see it for himself. He dressed in his old field jacket, the one with the worn elbows he still kept from his student days, and he walked into his own dining room as a stranger. The phrase test suggests something staged, but it was simpler than that. He wanted to experience Shade Muraval the way an ordinary guest would, before the staff knew his face. He had no intention of confronting anyone. He would have been content to observe and make changes later, quietly, the way he had restructured a dozen companies before. Laureen Deschamps made that impossible. The laughter from the investors, the condescending tone, the reference to a more accessible palate, all of it happened within 30 seconds. And when Jean-Luc entered the room and revealed the truth, the entire careful plan for a quiet transition evaporated. By the time the dinner plates were cleared, the maitre d's phone had fired messages to 6 people. One of them worked in the Shadehouse marketing department. One of them was a journalist at a regional wine publication. The story was already moving. Within 2 hours, a summary appeared on a French wine forum. Within 4 hours, it had been translated into English on a popular wine blog. By the following morning, major outlets in France, Britain, and the United States were running variations of the same headline. Sommelier mocks guest, discovers he just bought the Vineyard. The story had everything: the arrogance of old-world gatekeeping, the quiet dignity of a man who refused to flinch, the cinematic reversal that felt scripted but was entirely real. Laureen Deschamps woke the next day to 47 text messages and a formal request from the Shadehouse management to attend a meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. She arrived in the same dining room where she had delivered her line. Jean-Luc Fortin was seated at the table. So was Elijah Ibarra. So was a representative from the Shadehouse legal counsel. Laureen sat down. She had prepared an apology. She had practiced it in front of her mirror. She opened her mouth to deliver it. Elijah Ibarra raised one hand. "Before you speak," he said, "there is something I want you to watch." He turned on a tablet. On the screen was security footage from the Shadehouse dining room dated 3 months earlier. In the video, Laureen Deschamps was speaking to a young couple. The husband was black French from Martinique. The wife was white. They had requested a bottle of the estate's premium Chateauneuf du Pape. Laureen's expression on the recording was unmistakable. She smiled. She tilted her head. And then she said, almost identical to what she had said to Elijah Ibarra, "Perhaps something more accessible would suit your palate better. We keep a lovely table wine from the Languedoc for guests who are still learning." She had done it before. She had done it for years, and Elijah Ibarra had the receipts. The tape stopped. The room was colder than the cellar. Laureen's prepared apology died on her tongue. "The question I have for you, madame," Elijah said, "is not whether you are sorry. The question is how many others there were, and whether you can name them before I do." That was the moment the story stopped being about a single embarrassing dinner and started being about something much larger. French wine culture had a gatekeeping problem, and Laureen Deschamps was about to become its unwilling symbol. But what happened next, the public fallout, the investigation, and the letter that arrived 3 days later from the oldest wine family in Burgundy, nobody could have predicted. The story broke open on a Friday morning. A journalist named Camille Renaud, who had spent 6 years covering the wine industry for a publication based in Lyon, received a tip from someone inside the Chateau. The source sent her a transcript of the exchange between Laureen and Elijah Ibarra, word for word, including the line about the Languedoc table wine and the audible smirk from the investor's table. Camille published the piece under a headline that no one in the French wine establishment wanted to read: "The Sommelier, the Billionaire, and the Cellar Door That Finally Swung Both Ways." Within 2 hours, major French dailies picked it up. By noon, the BBC had a correspondent live from Avignon. The story didn't just embarrass one woman. It lifted a rock off an entire industry, and what came scuttling out was ugly. By Saturday, a hospitality watchdog group in Paris had released a statement claiming they had received 17 complaints about Chateau Muraval's dining room in the past 5 years, all involving allegations of racial or class-based profiling. 11 of those complaints specifically named Laureen Deschamps. The Shaitao had quietly settled two of them with non-disclosure agreements. One of those NDAs was signed by a Moroccan tech entrepreneur who had been seated next to the service entrance during his anniversary dinner. Another was signed by a Brazilian diplomat who had been told, in front of his delegation, that the estate's best vintages were reserved for established collectors. Both settlements included clauses that prevented the victims from speaking publicly. Both were paid out of the Shaitao's discretionary fund, a line item few people outside management even knew existed. Jean-Luc Fortin, the managing partner who had been so eager to shake Elijah's hand, now found himself at the center of the storm. He had been at Miraval for 22 years. He knew about the complaints. He knew about the NDAs. He had signed both. In an emergency board meeting that weekend, he sat across from Elijah Ibarra, the new majority owner, and tried to explain. "This is the culture of the Grand Estates," he said, as if that were an explanation and not an indictment. "Certain clients expect a particular atmosphere." Elijah did not raise his voice. He simply asked Jean-Luc to read aloud the names on the settled complaints. Jean-Luc refused. Elijah put his phone on the table and asked a second time. Jean-Luc read the names. Then he resigned, effective immediately. The resignation was announced at 9 o'clock Monday morning. The stock of the holding company that managed the estate's hospitality arm dropped 8% within the hour. But the letter from Burgundy, that was the twist nobody saw coming. On Tuesday, a cream envelope arrived at the Shaitao. The return address belonged to Domaine de la Romanée Conti, the most prestigious wine producer in the world. For those who don't follow this world, Domaine de la Romanée Conti is not merely a vineyard. It is the Vatican of wine. Its bottles sell for tens of thousands of euros at auction. Its allocation list is more exclusive than any private club. When they speak, the industry listens. The letter was addressed not to Jean-Luc, not to the board, but to Elijah Ibarra personally. It was handwritten by the family's patriarch, a man in his 80s who almost never makes public statements. He wrote that he had followed the news with deep concern and profound shame. He admitted that his own family's estates had, for generations, maintained a system of allocation that quietly excluded buyers from certain nations, not through any written policy, but through the unspoken assumptions of who belonged. He called it the gentility of exclusion, a phrase so precisely crafted it landed like a blade. And then he proposed a meeting. He wanted to discuss a joint initiative, a fellowship program to train sommeliers of color, funded by his family's foundation and hosted at Chateau Miraval. The oldest wine dynasty in the world was offering to partner with the man Laurent Deschamps had dismissed as having an unsuitable palate. That letter changed the story overnight. It was no longer about one sommelier's arrogance. It was about an entire culture's reckoning. Other estates began releasing statements. Some were genuine. Many were carefully lawyered. A few were spectacularly tone-deaf. The head of a prominent Bordeaux Chateau gave an interview in which he said, "We have always welcomed everyone who can afford our wines," a statement that managed to be both defensive and oblivious. A younger generation of French winemakers, many of whom had trained abroad, began speaking out about the aristocracy of the tasting room. A black sommelier in Paris, a woman named Fatou Diop who had spent a decade fighting for recognition in a field that treated her like a curiosity, published an essay titled, "I Am Not Your Accessibility Statement." It was shared 200,000 times in 2 days. The hashtag Ouvert la Porte, opened the door, trended in France for a week. Back at Miraval, Elijah Ibarra made his first public statement as owner. He stood at a press conference in the Chateau's courtyard, not in the dining room, deliberately, and spoke for 7 minutes. He did not mention Laurent Deschamps by name. He did not need to. He announced that the Chateau would release all internal complaint records, that the NDAs would be voided with the permission of the signatories, and that a formal audit of hearing and promotion practices would begin immediately. He also announced something unexpected. He was not going to fire Laurent. He was going to require her to serve as the Chateau's liaison for the new Diversity Fellowship program. She would be training the next generation of sommeliers under close supervision, her expertise used in service of a mission she had spent her career undermining. "Redemption is not a gift," Elijah said. "It is an assignment." Laureen Deschamps, standing in the back of the courtyard, had no choice but to accept. The woman who had once dictated who deserved fine wine was now accountable to the people she had excluded. But the deepest revelation was still coming. 3 weeks after the story broke, an investigative journalist named Yves Morrow published a feature in Le Monde revealing that Laureen's behavior was not an isolated case, not even at the same vineyard. He had uncovered a network of informal guest profiles, maintained by maitre d's and sommeliers at over a dozen elite French wine estates. These profiles included notes on guests' accents, clothing brands, perceived national origin, and estimated net worth. They were shared between properties through encrypted messaging groups. Some were used to assign tables. Some were used to decide which wines to offer and which to claim were unavailable. The system had no name, no policy document, no central administrator. But it was as real as the limestone in the cellars, and it had been operating for at least 20 years. The journalist's source was a former sommelier who had kept screenshots. The screenshots were published in the article. The names were redacted, but the pattern was unambiguous. The gatekeeping was not one person's failing. It was architecture. Elijah Ibarra read the article on a flight to Nigeria. When he landed, he called Raymond Cole, his personal advisor, and said only, "Now we have a map." He then called Fatou Diop, the Parisian sommelier who had written the essay. He offered her a job, director of a new institute funded by his foundation that would document and dismantle the informal exclusion systems in the global wine trade. She accepted within an hour. The institute was announced on a Sunday evening. By Monday morning, 5 major estates had already reached out to partner. One had not. And that estate's refusal, the one that came with a thinly veiled legal threat, would set up the final confrontation that ended this story in a way no one saw coming. The holdout was Chateau de Vaugirard, a Saint-Emilion Premier Grand Cru Classé whose cellars held vintages older than the nations that banned them. Its patriarch, Gérard de Larache, had been a fixture of French wine aristocracy since the 1960s. His photograph appeared in magazines with presidents. His handshake opened credit lines worth millions. When the institute was announced, he responded not with silence but with a letter, 7 pages, delivered by courier to Elijah Ibarra and to Yves Morrow at Le Monde. It threatened legal action for defamation, demanded a full retraction of the ridiculous allegation of systemic exclusion, and warned that Vaugirard would vigorously defend the honor of its house against these American-style purity campaigns. The letter was not private. De Larache leaked it to a sympathetic wine columnist before the ink was dry, hoping to rally the old guard. Instead, it backfired. Elijah read the letter twice. Then he did what de Larache least expected. He published it full text on the Institute's new website along with a single sentence: "Transparency is not negotiable." Then he announced a summit, the Etats Généraux du Vin, to be held at Miraval on the last Saturday of September. He invited every major estate in the country. 42 accepted. 1 did not. De Larache publicly called the summit a circus and declined. He believed his absence would render the gathering irrelevant. He was wrong. The day of the summit arrived under a sky the color of old iron. Producers from Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Alsace, the Loire, and the Rhône filled the Chateau's renovated assembly hall, a room that had once hosted noble weddings and now faced a different kind of ceremony. Journalists lined the back. Cameras rolled live. Fatou Diop opened the proceedings with 10 minutes of unflinching data: the leaked guest profiles, the encrypted messages, the admissions from 3 former sommeliers who had come forward. She did not name names. She did not have to. Then she yielded the floor. Laureen Deschamps walked to the podium. She had not spoken publicly since the scandal broke, except for a brief statement drafted by a lawyer. The woman who now faced the cameras looked smaller than the one who had tilted her head at Elijah, but her voice was steady. She recounted in precise detail the habit of profiling she had learned from a senior sommelier at a Bordeaux estate where she trained 20 years earlier. She named the man. He was dead, but the system, she said, was alive. Then she paused, reached into a folder, and held up a single page. It was a typewritten note from 1998, sent to her by Martin Giraud, then head sommelier at Chateau de Vaugirard. She had kept it, forgotten in a drawer, found again only when Elijah asked her to search her memory, not just her conscience. She read the line that ended the old guard's defense. The Nigerian minister asked for a vertical tasting. I told him we were closed for inventory. These people do not understand wine. They only understand exclusion when it is applied firmly enough. The room went silent. Cameras captured Gérard de Larache's name not spoken but hovering above every word. The system that had operated in whispers for a century had its signature on paper. By evening, de Larache's lawyer issued a second statement, this one not threatening but conciliatory. Vaugirard would cooperate with the Institute's audit. They would remove the sommelier, who had already retired. They would, for the first time, open their board to external review. The statement closed with a phrase that tasted of forced humility. We have learned that tradition without examination becomes exclusion. The old guard had bent without breaking, but it had bent. 6 months later, the Institute's first class of 12 fellows gathered at Miraval. They came from Senegal, Mauritius, Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil, and working-class Marseille. One was a former grape picker from the Rhone whose father had never been allowed inside the tasting room where he delivered harvest bins. Another was a young Cameroonian woman named Adele Nkosi, who had applied twice to Vaugirard's hospitality program and been rejected both times without explanation. She now stood in the dining room where Laurine Deschamps had once committed her most famous blunder. The room had changed. The tablecloths were the same. The limestone walls were the same, but Laurine was laying out glasses for the graduation dinner, moving quietly under the watch of Fadou Diop. The woman who had mocked an accessible palate was now teaching others how to welcome every palate that came through the door. Elijah Ibarra entered last. He wore a simple dark jacket, not the work coat but nothing that demanded attention. He sat at the very table where he had once been offered a lesser wine. Adele Nkosi approached with a bottle. It was the Croz's Hermitage, the same vintage he had chosen that night, but with a new label. At the bottom, in small letters, it read simply, Ouvert, open. She poured a taste into his glass, her hand perfectly steady. Mr. Ibarra, she said, I believe this one is accessible. He smiled without looking at anything but the wine. Yes, he said, it always was. That night after the dinner, Elijah walked alone through the Vineyard rows. The Grenache vines were just pushing toward the late summer sun. He knelt at the base of a 40-year-old stem and lifted a handful of the red clay that gave Miraval its name. The soil was warm. It did not know what had happened above it. It only knew what it had always known, that it would nourish whatever was planted in it, without asking permission, without reading the lineage of the roots. In the distance, the chateau glowed yellow through the dusk. Inside, someone was playing music. Someone else was laughing. The gate that had been pushed open from the inside now stood ajar for everyone, and the wine, finally, belonged to whoever was brave enough to taste it. The soil at Chateau Miraval does not know the difference between a hand that has signed a deed and a hand that has never been allowed through the door. It only knows the roots that reach into it, the rain that falls on it, the sun that pulls the fruit toward sweetness. What happened above that soil, the gate that was pried open, the institution that was forced to look at its own reflection, will not show up in the next vintage. But it will show up in the next generation of sommeliers, the next class of fellows, the next time a server hesitates before making an assumption and chooses instead to simply pour the wine. Elijah Ibarra still wears that same work jacket. He was asked about it recently, at a conference in Geneva, by a young man from Ghana who wanted to know why a billionaire would hold on to something so worn. Elijah smiled. Because it reminds me what people assumed about me, he said. And it reminds me that their assumptions were never my problem to solve. That is the quiet architecture of every gate-kept world. The gatekeepers believe the gate is permanent. They forget that it has hinges, and hinges can swing both ways. The question this story leaves behind is not about wine. It is about every room you have ever walked into where someone measured your worth before you opened your mouth. Every classroom, every boardroom, every tasting room, every stage. Who decided who belonged? And what happens when the people they excluded finally own the building? Drop a comment below. Tell me about a moment when someone underestimated you and how that moment shaped the person you became. I read every single one. If this story lit something in you today, send it to one person who is still standing outside a gate that was never really locked. The best stories are the ones we share. And if you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There is another story coming next week, one that begins in a very different room but ends in the same place. The truth, finally, opening a door. Until then, may every gate you face remember it has hinges.